In this video, we'll be looking at how to use some of the websites mentioned in my first mapping video, Maps for Family History. I'll show you how to use the Tasmanian Resource List Map, the Ordnance Survey Collection at the National Library of Scotland, and how to identify places on maps you find in the archive. A lot of maps have now been digitised, so we can look at them on our computers and zoom right in to see the detail. A lot have been geo-referenced, which means we can look at them laid on top of other maps to compare how the landscape has changed or stayed the same over time. Every archive and organisation will have different ways to show their maps, but there are some basic tools that are common across them all. If you've ever used Google Maps, you'll be familiar with using the scroll wheel on your mouse or something similar on your trackpad to zoom in and out of the image. Here's the Australian Capital Territory's historic map page. Now, one problem you sometimes come across is that trying to zoom ends up just moving the map around. It ends up panning the picture instead of zooming it. If you press Shift and then try to zoom by scrolling or using your trackpad, then that should help you zoom in and out. If all else fails, there will always be some kind of zoom bar or buttons on the side of the screen that you can use. Now we are going to start with Tasmania's list map collection. A lot of government-hosted map pages are focused on providing resources for growth and environment, but often there is a historic set buried in there somewhere. Historic maps help us to visualise where someone lived, but also who their neighbours were and how close to other features they lived. So here we have the main list map page. If we click on Base Maps, there are a few different options for the basic map that we can see. Each of these is useful for different purposes. Now, it's useful to start with something simple. For this exercise, you'll want nice, clear labels. So we're going to start with the default topographic layer. You can change to something else later on, depending on what aspect of the landscape you're interested in. So then we click on Layers and then Add Layer. Here are all the different maps that you can view. You can see that there is a search bar, but I like to scroll down to see if anything new has been added. So we'll go down to Imagery and Maps. And you can see that there are a couple of historic layers here, historic aerial photographs and maps and charts. Now, some of these layers cover the whole island, while others are restricted to small areas. You can choose more than one at a time. So today we're going to look at the Land District Charts and Sprent's Book Mosaic. We add them in by pressing the little green plus. Sometimes it seems like nothing is happening, and if you try clicking again, this message will pop up. Now, the website can be a little bit slow, especially if you have a slower internet connection, so just give it time. We'll close that box and so we close that box, and now you can see that the island is covered entirely with a mosaic of different maps. Now, first of all, we're going to look at the Land District Charts, so we want to turn off Sprent's Book Mosaic. You can see that there are a few different settings here, but just press the blue tick to turn a layer off and on again. Unfortunately, it isn't possible to search this layer for individual names, so I actually find it easier to turn off the layer and then zoom in to the area that I'm interested in. So let's say you're looking for someone who you know lives around Campbelltown in central Tasmania. Once you've found that area, turn the layer back on, and then you can zoom in again and move the map around looking for your individual. Now these maps have been updated and written over well into the 20th century. So some areas have had their details removed, but often the name of the very first European landholder is still recorded. So let's have a look at our other layer. We will turn off the land district chart. We're going to turn on Sprint's mosaic, and then we're going to click Zoom to Layers Extent. Now this is a useful button. Most maps will have something like this. It may look like these little arrows pointing out. It may be the shape of the place. Sometimes it may look like a little home button, and that will set the map to a default view. Now that's very useful if you've been scrolling around quite a bit and lost where you are. You can reset the map and start again. Now this layer is specific to Hobart. So we're going to zoom into the layer, and here you can see the Hobart Rivulet running through the town. Now this layer is specific to Hobart. And if we zoom in, we can see this blue line of the Hobart Rivulet running through the town. You can see that there are street names and also individuals' names on this map. Now something you can do here is play with the transparency. So this bar here will adjust the transparency of this layer, and you can see what is now underneath it. Now this is where it is useful to have a base map with nice clear writing, so that it stands out underneath without distracting from the detail of your second map. Often these maps will also have a basic set of tools that help you to find particular features. So here we have map tools. If you hover over each of these, it will tell you what it does. Now you can also annotate your map by putting in points, text and circles or squares, and then if you make a map that you want to save, if you annotate a particular area, you can create a bookmark for it, and then if you go here and you will find it, and there is a link that you can save. So if you go back to that link, it will show you all your annotations that you've made. Next, we're going to look at the UK Ordnance Survey charts, which have all been digitised and made freely available by the National Library of Scotland. The direct link to the maps is provided in the resources below this video, but here we go to Digital Resources, down to Map Images, where you'll find a few different options. Today we'll go to Geo-referenced Maps, and here you can see that there are a few different search options. Now we will look for Devizes, where my mother was born, and have a look here, and it's identified it correctly. Now then we can go through some of these layers to find a map that suits the period we're interested in. Being a map nerd, I always like to find the earliest possible map that I can, but as you can see there are a few different options. Again, there is this transparency bar so that you can compare what was there to what is there now. And if you click on side by side, it will let you choose two different maps, and as you move one, the other one will move as well, so they're both showing the same area. Now they've also made a 1796 map of the world available. So after this video is finished, have a little look at that, find Australia and see what they thought of Tasmanian geography in 1796. Now finally, many of you are looking at people who weren't based in Tasmania or the UK. So hopefully these two websites have given you an idea of how some of these databases work, and there's a list of resources of other locations included in this chapter. But although these georeferenced maps are great, you'll usually find even more resources as images that you can download. These are very handy, but I'll finish up with some hints on finding your ancestors' locations on them. So we'll start off with the David Rumsey Map Collection. This one is a massive resource. It's not always the most user-friendly for searching, but it has an enormous and eclectic catalogue, and it's very useful for finding more unusual locations and maps. Now you may remember this Google map that I made of some of my Dutch ancestry. There are instructions on how to make a similar map in the written part of this chapter, but let's see if we can find anything from some of these older areas near Amsterdam. So my dad was born in Haarlemmermeer, and so we're going to search for that area. Now we'll just go with Haarlem because that is going to give us a broader area. Now their results only give us 4 different maps. If I'd searched for something like Amsterdam, then I would have probably found a lot more that might have included this area. Now if there were more, then I could sort them by the date that they were published, which can be a useful way to find your earliest or your latest. And then we're going to have a little look at this one here from 1575. Now this is a favourite map of mine, it's quite lovely. I don't actually have any more information about where my ancestors might have lived, but this gives me an idea of what the area looked like, what kind of countryside it was that they might have lived in. Now you can export this map and in a number of different sizes, so you can download it for free so that you can have a look at it in closer detail without needing an internet connection. Have a look also for this button View in Georeferencer. A lot of these maps have been laid over the top of modern maps, so you can see approximately where they were positioned at the time. Now, if you have a little bit more information about where your ancestor was born, you might find a map with them on it. So here we're looking at a map from 1814 of the land given to former convicts in Sandy Bay, just south of Hobart. Now this is a redrawn version that the Tasmanian Archives and Heritage Office holds, which I'm using because it's a nice clean version, a nice tidy one that's easy to see the detail on. So we're going to use Bernard Walford as our example here. Often you might not know the area that your ancestor lived in, and so it might seem quite hard to work out where a property was. But let's think about what we know from the map as it is. Now up here it tells us that it is in the parish of Queenborough. And you also know that Bernard was based somewhere around Hobart. So it's a good bet that that is a parish within or just near to Hobart. Now the shape of this boundary does suggest that that is some kind of a water's edge, and the word Sandy Bay supports that. This must be on a bay, a harbour, a coastline of some kind. Up here we have Flagstaff at Mount Nelson, so that's a nice clue. And then there's a river running down beside his property, forming one of the edges. So if we pull up a map of Hobart on Google, then we'll have a little bit of a look around. Is there somewhere here that might be called, Sandy Bay? There we go. We have a place called Sandy Bay. And it's on the River Derwent, so that is why it's called Sandy Bay. That's why there's a water edge. Now, is there also somewhere that might be a Mount Nelson Flagstaff? We've got Nelson Road here. That's a good clue. It's called Mount. It has a flagstaff, which might indicate that it is quite visible. It's probably a hill or a mountain. And so here we have Mount Nelson. So we've got the general area. We know that he was somewhere around here. Now looking at the shape of the river here, looking at this water's edge, there's this almost 90-degree angle here. Can we find that on our map? And that looks remarkably similar, doesn't it? That 90-degree turn. So Bernard is just left of it. So if we go here and we'll zoom in a little bit, so somewhere along here. Now Bernard's property also has that little river running down the edge of it that runs down from Mount Nelson. And here we have a river that is running down from Mount Nelson, and it probably used to meet the river somewhere down here. So that looks like a fairly likely area. So we found this rough location. Bernard's property was somewhere around here. Now, do remember to check for street names. There isn't a street around here that's named after Bernard, but just down a little bit we've got Fisher Avenue, which is where Edward Fisher's property was. So we know that Bernard's property went to roughly this area about here. So that gives us a good idea of how much land Bernard had. Now sometimes you won't be able to narrow it down that much. It's almost always possible to find the area that someone was in. Features do change. Places get renamed, rivers get diverted. Rest Point, for instance, this bit here, this isn't actually on the map, but a lot of that has been manipulated by people over time. There are usually enough features to work on. Now do keep an eye out on the orientation of the original map, especially older ones. Having a north orientation is a relatively recent convention. so you might need to turn it around a couple of times to work out which way is up. Now with that, I'll leave you to explore some map collections. I make no promise that you'll find a map with your ancestor's name on it, but at the very least you'll build up an image of the world they lived in.